Hi everyone, welcome back to the Art of Save Scumming. I hope this video finds you well. I'm using a little bit different audio setup today, so I would be very interested in hearing your feedback and how this sounds. Sound off in the comments section down below, and if you haven't already, don't forget to give the channel a sub. It definitely helps out. Today's video, I wanted to go back to the basics because it seems to me, since the announcement of Immortal Empires becoming part of the base game, that a large increase in the player base has come to pass, and that's fantastic. But I'm also seeing in the comments section that there are lots of people that simply are not understanding the base mechanics of the game, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to really dig into how the base mechanics work. And to do that, I have a High Elf campaign set up here. Now, I understand that the High Elves are a Warhammer 2 race, but if we're going to talk about vanilla, how to explain Warhammer 3 to somebody as basic as possible. High Elves are as vanilla as they get, specifically when we're talking about Etain, Tyrion's faction. So what I've got here is a turn 6 campaign that has access to some of the base mechanics. I've played this thing far enough to get to what I want to talk about today, essentially. So first things first, provinces. This is the province of Etain. It has 4 settlements in it, as you can see, and those settlements or regions are known as Lothern, Angerial, Tower of Lycene, and Shrine of Assyrian. Now, inside of each of those regions are some buildable buildings, and those buildings do different things. For instance, you might want to increase the growth of the region. So if I were to build this building for 1,000 gold, and it would take 1 turn to complete, and I would gain an extra 18 growth and casualty replenishment rate for any armies that are in the region, plus 3%. Well, what does that growth do? If we look over here, this is our population surplus, and that population surplus can be spent in any of these regions. For instance, this building chain here, the root building chain, we are currently sitting at a tier 2 settlement at Lothern called the Elven Village, but in order to go up to the Elven Town, we need 2 surplus points. We currently only have 1. However, if we were to look at Angerial or Tower of Lycene, or excuse me, just Angerial, we can upgrade the current hamlet to a haven simply by spending that point. You can see that the growth is located here, and that's how you can see the breakdown. So if we were to do this again, well, first of all, 375, 97 of 375, but if we were to do this, then now we're at 97 of 125. There is an incentive to get your base level buildings up quickly so that you can take advantage of those population surplus points. So what does upgrading that settlement do? Well, first off, it's going to give us an extra 50 gold. It's going to increase the defensive supplies, the growth, the corruption, untainted in the region, and grants grants an additional construction slot in this region. So you can see that currently it would give us an extra 1 slot. If we were to come over here and upgrade to this, it's going to give us an additional 2 slots that are currently locked. We can also perhaps build this building, which gives us income and tradable resources. So let's talk about income for a second. Currently, our treasury is located here, and that treasury is made up of a couple things. The first is the background income and the building income. You'll notice that we are currently making a total income of 3,931. So why is our current projected income only 1,865? Well, we have currently fielded a single army, and that single army costs us this much upkeep. If you subtract those numbers, you'll get that. The other thing about that is fielding multiple armies is not proportional. So if I were to simply recruit this guy, so we have the cost of that lord, but then we also have opened up an additional supply line. So that supply line causes us to get an extra 4%, so our additional upkeep is 93. So we talked about that money, but what about those tradable resources? Well, let's talk about trade for a second. Currently, we have no trade partners, but if we were to go into diplomacy, which we'll talk about here in just a second, let's find Illyrian and trade with Illyrian.
For the Phoenix King. And I bid you your will is done.
So you notice that our income went up, and if we go to our treasury summary, we can see that we're making 233 additional gold per turn in trade. If we go into the trade tab, we can see that the breakdown for that is the resources are valued at 162 gold per turn, and that is at a rate of 9 chests, exporting 100%. But then we also have tariffs, and that makes up our additional balance. You will eventually get to the point where you'll have a bunch of tradable resources. You can see there's a whole bunch of types here. And you want to keep an eye on that export number, or that export percentage. If you're, for instance, exporting only 80% of your elven trinkets, then you're not giving yourself that much of a bump by increasing the elven trinket production. The other thing you might do from an infrastructure standpoint in a given region is manage your control. You can see this building gives you plus 60 income and an additional 2 control. So what is control? Control is a mechanic that deals with rebellions and stability of your provinces. You can find the control numbers a couple different ways. You can hover over a settlement in the province and find the control number dictated by that little red face right there. You can see that it's going down. It's going down by 10. You've got the current number, which is 36, and it's going down by minus 10. The breakdown there is, we have some positive things going on. We have buildings that are helping with it. We have an army garrison in the region that's helping it. But we have a base difficulty modifier. I'm playing on legendary, so it's a minus 8. We have events in the region that have caused this to go down. There was a crisis, or not a crisis, a dilemma last turn, taxing the region. So if we were to do that, for instance, then we would see that that goes down to minus 6. Taxes, go figure, people don't like taxes, right? And then provincial instability, we fought a bunch of battles in this region. So that's going to be minus 3 next turn, minus 2, etc., and that will eventually disappear as long as we're not fighting inside the province confines. You can also see that there are some detrimental effects and potential positive effects depending on where you are on the control bar. Currently, we're sitting here between minus 50 and 75, or excuse me, minus 25 and 50, and that gives us reduced campaign site, minus 5 growth, plus 4 control, which is a positive thing. Recruitment costs, our armies cost us more, and our income is reduced. But if we were to get it all the way up over here, you can see it's hard to maintain that because we get a minus 8 control for being up in that region, but we get all those campaign benefits. If we reach minus 100 control, then the turn following the fall to that minus 100 level will generate a rebellion at the province capital. So if this was minus 100, we hit end turn, or it's going to be minus 100 at the end turn. The following turn, there will be an army standing here. It will be relatively weak, and we will probably be able to beat it with just the garrison. But it probably won't attack us if it can't take us on. Each turn, it's going to sit there and raid and grow in strength to the point where you will have to raise an army to defeat it if you can't entice it to attack your settlement. So managing control in your regions is really important, so that you don't have those rebellions occur. There are some factions that benefit from rebellions, by the way, so the High Elves are not one of them. Moving on from infrastructure, there's obviously some other things that are going on in here that are High Elf specific, but generally speaking, you're going to find at least 3 types of buildings in every faction that are going to deal with these mechanics that we've discussed. Let's move on to military. So these military buildings are going to grant the ability to recruit these different types of units. You can see these basic military buildings have a building tree, and you get access to better and better units as that tier increases. Generally speaking, especially with the High Elves, I would say stay away from the base military buildings for their first several turns, because you want to build that economy, and you end up getting Lothern Sea Guard from these settlements anyway. You also, for almost every faction, are going to have the advanced military buildings. This is, for instance, going to give you access to your artillery, your chariots, your monstrous units, etc., etc. You'll notice that in this instance, there's only a couple of these that you can build in minor settlements. But if we were to go over here and look at Lothern, for instance, we can see that we've got more things. We can build dragons, and access to wizards and things like that. So those advanced military buildings are going to be, again, specific to your capital cities. In addition to the infrastructure buildings and your basic and advanced military, you have defensive buildings. So this one has to do with plagues and control and reducing corruption in the region that we'll talk about here in just a second. And this one has to do with defense. So this is going to give you additional spearmen, archers, and reavers in this province. So if it were to be attacked, the garrison currently looks like this, and it will add those units to that garrison. There are also unique buildings located in some areas of some provinces. For instance, if we were to look at Lothorn here, we have these Straits of Lothorn, and the Straits of Lothorn give us extra 20 growth, income trade from tariffs, 10%, tradable resources plus 5% faction-wide, and of course some extra income. That can be upgraded as we go up in our route building chain, all the way up to an extra 800 per turn growth, extra income, trade, etc., etc. There's also unique buildings in the form of ports, and ports are pretty important because they do a couple things. You can see that I can now reach into these sea areas on the same turn as going into the ocean, because I can use this port to get there. If I didn't use the port, then I would lose my campaign movement range when I entered the water, because I have to embark into the water. Same thing is true when going the other way. If you look here, I basically will not lose any campaign movement range going into the water, and I can come right back out of the water, and I'm not going to lose any. Ports are also economic and growth hubs, so they're going to give us an extra 110 growth per turn with a basic port. Most ports are going to be able to get only to level 3, which is going to give us 300 and plus 20 growth, but there are some ports available at the tier 5 level, and you can see that those are the benefits, generally speaking, for a tier 5 port, and those only occur, of course, in major settlements. The other thing that we have access to are these tradable resources. You can see denoted here by this icon, there is wine available, and as we talked about when it comes to our tradable resources, this wine would give us per cask of wine, gives us 15 gold per unit of resource. And obviously there's not going to be just one there. It depends on what tier that resource is, so keep that in mind. Once you have completed a region, you will have the option to set a commandment. When you first initiate the completion of the province, it will look like this. It'll have a no commandment set. But the High Elves have very powerful commandments. This one sets income from tariffs plus 4%, income from all buildings. This one is minus 5 corruption that we'll talk about here in a second. Recruit rank and local recruit capacity, growth and construction cost, and then campaign movement range for enemies, ambush success chance, etc., etc. So these are very powerful. You have access to these whenever you complete a region. Generally speaking, most regions are going to have at least 2 settlements in them. They may be 3 settlements, but there are some that have only 1. And a good example of that would be Galleon's Graveyard that we can't see down here because it's obscured by the fog of war. But this would be an example of a single settlement province. So you win that, you get the ability to set one of these commandments. And usually what I end up doing is this one, because that's a faction-wide buff for trade tariffs. Let's talk about technologies for a second. So this is the tech tree. And the tech tree is different for every faction. The High Elf one happens to be pretty good. I like it. And a selection of a technology here will grant the buff. So you can see that if I select cartridge ammunition, it's going to give me a reload reduction time for our equal bolt floors, which is our artillery unit as the High Elves, and it's going to take 6 turns to complete. You can see here that this one is currently locked behind some kind of requirement. It requires the building the archive, and to do that I've got to have a settlement that is at least tier 3, I believe. And yes, the archive is a level 3 building, and it can only be constructed in a major settlement. So I will build that building, and after I build it, it'll take, or I initiate building, it'll take 4 turns, and then I will have access to this technology, which will give me recruitment cost minus 6% for all my units, as long as I have $1,500 to spend at the time. Pretty self-explanatory. We talked about the treasury, but almost every faction has some kind of secondary resource. So I want you to think about it like this. You spend this on your general expenses, and then there's something else that you're doing on the campaign map to gain your secondary resource, and you usually use your secondary resource to gain an edge on your competitors. In this instance, we're talking about High Elves, so we're talking about influence, and influence has some interesting things that it can be used for. Their special mechanic is the Intrigue at Court, where you can spend some of that influence to improve relations or decrease relations. For instance, I could do something like this and decrease the relations. Obviously, that can be very powerful. We'll talk about diplomacy here in just a second, but the other thing that it does for the High Elves is allow you to recruit better heroes. So if we were to look here, I only have the choices of these 2 heroes that have negative traits on them because I only have 7 influence. But if I had 10 influence, then I could get this guy, which is +2 if he's standing in the province. This guy gives our hero extra charge bonus. We go really good and go up to 40 influence, for instance, then I can get increased campaign movement range and ammunition for the entire army. So that's obviously very good. So this again gives you the ability, your secondary resources spent on things to help give you an extra edge. Let's talk about diplomacy. We saw a little bit of diplomacy earlier when we were talking about that trade agreement, but there are other things that you can do. We'll hit the quick deals because it gives us a couple categories. There are more things that you can do that we'll talk about in another video, but the basic things are the non-aggression pact, and what this does is basically say, hey, I'm not going to attack you, you're not going to attack me. I can currently get one with Illyrian if I wanted to. The trade agreement sets up that trade agreement that we talked about. Just because I have this agreement does not mean that I can just walk all over their lands. So a military access pact, for instance, will allow me to walk on their lands. If I walk on their lands without this, I will trespass, and if I trespass, then I will incur negative relations. I think it's -10 per occurrence. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. You want to get those military access pacts before you start walking all over somebody's land. If you're from America, you understand this. The defensive alliance is interesting in that if I have this defensive alliance with somebody and they are attacked or I am attacked, they are drawn into my war. If I do not join the war, I will gain a negative reliability rating. So currently I'm very high, which means that everybody is going to trust my deals that I try to push their way, and everything will go off generally without a negative modifier attached to the deal. The lower your rating, the harder it is to get things. So if I sign this agreement with Illyrian, they get attacked, I have to join their war. However, that does not automatically enter me into wars with anybody that they're currently fighting. They're currently at war with Tyrannok, for instance. Just because I signed this agreement doesn't mean I go to war with Tyrannok. In fact, I can't go to war with Tyrannok unless they declare war on me or I actively declare war on them, because they've already initiated the aggressive situation with Illyrian, so there's really no way that I can be drawn into a war unless I voluntarily go into the war or they attack me. Military alliances are a little bit different in that we've moved from the defensive nature of the conflict. So if I'm sitting there minding my own business and I get attacked with a defensive alliance, my friends have to come help me, or I have to go help my friends if they're attacked. Not so with the military alliance. You also are not automatically drawn into the wars retroactively, but if your friends attack somebody, you are now answerable for their wars. So you have to join their wars, or you'll incur that negative reliability penalty. Confederations are the act of adding that faction to yours. So you're going to directly integrate that faction into yours. So if I were to confederate Calidor over here, then I would get their lands, I'd get their armies, and Calidor, for all intents and purposes, would no longer exist on the campaign map. They are part of me now. Confederations carry negative diplomatic relations with for a period of time, in which case after that period expires, you will be able to make another confederation. So that keeps you from just running wild and making confederations. We're not going to cover the rights in detail because this isn't something that's across the factions, but there are several factions that have extra buffs that you can do, and they essentially are a thing that happens that has a cooldown and an effect, an effect duration and a cooldown. There are other factions that have something similar. Just keep in mind that there is this thing for the High Elves, and some other factions do this too, but there are other things that are more powerful in some other factions. So the High Elves have very powerful rights, but it's not the most powerful mechanic on the face of the game, so to speak. Let's talk about corruption for a second, because corruption is a little bit of a weird one. You can see here, this province is mine, and it has no corruption in it. It's what we would call untainted. This region, however, is tainted with Slaanesh corruption. You can see that there are several types of corruption. We have undivided corruption, we have vampiric, Skaven, Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh, and Tzeentch corruption. These have different impacts depending on how severe the corruption is. This is currently getting pretty bad, and it can be positive or negative depending on who you're playing. These are High Elves, so they are going to have negative impacts from the corruption in their region. So if we look at the effects to them, the effects to them are they're going to take attrition. So if their army was standing outside the settlement, they would be taking attrition. They're taking a -6 control debuff in their region, and then they're also losing income every turn. If there's multiple types of corruption, the one that's most prolific is going to dominate. It's going to push others down. You can see that all other corruption -1. So if we were suddenly to introduce some other corruption in there, then these numbers would get kind of crazy. You can have compounding effects from different types of corruption as well. So just throwing that out there. If you are a demon faction, you want to spread your corruption. So if we were playing as Nakaria that starts up here, for instance, this region would help him if he was operating in it. He gets extra seduction bonuses, he gets control bonuses, the disciple armies get bigger and more powerful. There's a whole bunch of things that you get from increasing corruption if that is your chosen type of corruption that you want to spread. So just keep in mind that that mechanic is there. One of the things that I neglected to say when we were talking about the research, a research rate back here is 100%, and this can go up and down. One of the things that you can get is an ancillary.
Protector.
We go in here, details, ancillaries called a student when you're the High Elves, and that will increase that research rate. So keep in mind that that's a thing. Now, in your character menu, you have items and ancillaries. So this one is currently given -10% casualty suffered from storm attrition. There's a whole bunch of them that give you different effects, and then that's usually an effect on the army or the region. This section is for the character specifically. So the only item I currently have is this potion of healing, and it gives a regeneration. Let's move on to skills. Every time you level up your character, you're going to get a skill point, and you can spend them in a couple different ways. There's a clear division here. You can see that there's the blue line, and that's going to give you campaign effects. The red line, which is going to buff your army generally. The yellow line, which is going to generally buff the player, or not the player, the character themselves. And then in this instance, we're talking about the High Elf, so the High Elf characters have a dedication line, and you get to select one of these dedications. Some other factions have similar mechanics. And then there's the unique line. So this is specific to Tyrion himself, and he has actually a bifurcation in his special line, his unique line, in that he can either go Magisterium of Ulthuan and get these buffs, or he can go Bloodline of Narion and get these buffs. There's also the top line. I don't actually know the technical term for this, but there are additional skills up here like speed, extra ward. This one's a good one because it spreads some of the experience around, particularly for a legendary lord, because that legendary lord is going to continue to accrue experience, even though he's maxed out at level 50. So having 3 points here is going to spread that love around, because you're still going to be using them after they're maxed here. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover today is movement. Movement on the campaign map is governed by stances. Currently, Tyrion is in no stance because he is garrisoned. And you can see that the replenishment rate here is relatively high. But if I stand outside the settlement, then the replenishment rate goes down. You get a little buff for being inside the settlement. Currently, we're in no stance, and this is our movement range. You can see the darker green is our movement range, and there are no modifiers to our army at this point in time. But if I were to do something like this and go into force march stance, you can see that we have a larger campaign movement range at the cost of recruitment being disabled. We show up to any battles that we fight tired. We have a reduced chance of defending against an ambush, so we can be ambushed more easily. And if we are attacked in this stance and we lose, our army gets wiped out. We can't run away. We're forced to stand and fight. So use this stance sparingly. We need to move a whole bunch of distance. Say we're going over here and we got to get there quick. That's what you would use that for. We also have the ambush stance. The ambush stance is interesting in that this army is now hidden from the AI. So if we were at war with Safari, for instance, and they try to come over here and take the Shrine of Assyrian, and they go through this red circle, it has the chance, a 45% chance of initiating an ambush, in which they will be disadvantaged, they won't be able to get into formation, and we have the element of surprise. It also gives us a penalty of 25% movement range. So we can't move as far if we're trying to ambush somebody than if we were moving in no stance, but we're also hidden, so keep that in mind. The other thing that we have access to that is pretty much ubiquitous across the factions is the encamp stance. And the encamp stance reduces our campaign movement range. If we go back to normal campaign movement range, it reduces by 50%. And it gives us immune to most attrition, which can be very beneficial in some cases, but it also gives us extra ambush defense. So you can move into a potentially ambushing army and expose their ambush. So that's pretty advantageous. It also gives us extra melee defense and leadership. It also gives us access to the global recruit pool, which is a pool of all of the units available in all the settlements. Now, currently, if you look at this, it looks exactly the same because we only have one region. But if we had multiple regions with different recruitment capabilities, then they would all show up in the global recruitment capacity. You can expand this with different availabilities in your tech tree. This particular faction of Howls has the Lilith's Blessing as their unique stance. Many factions have unique stances, but this one gives you 10 speed for spellcasters, miscast base chance, experience, so if you're trying to power level, and it only costs you 10%. So if you're basically sitting around trying to find something to do that turn, then you can enter Lilith's Lilith's Blessing stance, and it also increases your Winds of Magic power reserve. So if you're loitering around waiting for something to happen, then sometimes it can be beneficial if you have the campaign movement range to enter the stance and get yourself ready for a fight. All right, guys and gals, that's all I've got for this one. I wanted to, again, do a overview that is applicable to most factions across Warhammer 3, and I think that we accomplished that here today. I'm going to do another one that deals with some of the battle basics and things like that for our newer players out there. And, of course, if you learned something here today, then please sound off in the comment section down below. I appreciate you very much, and hopefully we'll see you on another video here at The Art of Save Scumming.